Good morning. My name is Sarah Deidre Kastorf, and I'm the Deputy Director of Government Affairs at the Wisconsin Counties Association. I am pleased to have the opportunity to moderate our February webinar series on diversity, equity, and inclusivity. Welcome to week 3, where we will be discussing getting started, moving from words to action. As I mentioned the last 2 weeks, discussions surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusivity can be very difficult to participate in and can get uncomfortable at times. Yet it is critical that counties begin to take steps toward meaningful discussions on diversity, equity, and inclusivity throughout the many roles they play, whether as an employer or provider of critical state and local services. Our 4-part webinar series is designed to introduce DEI to counties and provide you with some tools to get started. We all have a lot to learn on DEI, but you should know that this is a safe space in which to ask questions and to learn. Before I turn it over to our presenters today, I just want to mention how Q&A will work this morning. We will be using the chat and Q&A features on Zoom. Please feel free to input your comments or questions in the Q&A or chat feature throughout the presentation. Since we do have more than one speaker today, we will take questions at the end to ensure that all 3 of our presenters have time to get through their remarks. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker today, Benoy Jacob. He is the director of the Community Development Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. And I will leave it up to Benoy to explain to you why it is he is here presenting with us today. So at this time, Benoy, if you want to start sharing your screen, and we will turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. As I imagine my screen is now shared. Just make sure that looks perfect. So let me begin by thanking the Wisconsin Counties Association for inviting me to chat with you all today. I certainly appreciate the opportunity. This is an important topic and one that I've been sort of spending some time in for a little while. More precisely, sort of understanding how local governments, so cities and counties, implement an equity lens in their day-to-day operations. And so I'm excited to have this chance to spend a little bit of time with you all. The basis for my remarks today are going to be this report recently published through an organization called the ICMA. I imagine most of you are familiar with the ICMA, but just for those of you who aren't, it is the membership organization for city and county managers, both nationally and internationally. And I've worked with them on a few different projects. In this particular case, I served as a research fellow for the years 2018 to 2019, in which I was researching and looking at the way various communities, 7 in particular, 7 local governments, so cities and counties, implemented an equity lens in their organization. And so the basis or the motivation for this report, which you can access at this link that is on this slide here. I've also provided a PDF of the report to Sarah, and so you can also reach out to her or I for if you'd like a copy of it. But the motivation for that report was this reality that increasingly a large number of local governments are looking to implement an equity lens in their operations, and yet there's still a lot of uncertainty of how to do it, right? And so this report is really about moving words to action, right? So once you have established the idea that you want to advance equity through your public organization, how do you do it? And so I spent the better part of a year interviewing these 7 different jurisdictions, asking them, what their challenges were, how did they go about it, what would start to look like best practices. And so the result of that is this report, and then subsequently I'm going to give you really just a high level overview of some of the insights here. Because I've got, I think, sort of 30 minutes or so, really the report goes into a fair bit of detail about sort of the weeds of how you go about doing this. or some of the better practices, at least, that we see across the country. But so I want to just whittle this down to one simple insight. So if there's nothing else you take away from this presentation today, what I would like you to take away is that if you are implementing equity and if you choose to advance equity through your organization, you need to understand that equity is fundamentally organizational change. If you say you are going to advance equity at the city or county level, you have to fundamentally embrace the fact that what you are going to do is change the way your organization operates on a day-to-day basis. This was one of the clearest findings to come out of this study. So, and I'll just give you a little bit of background on that. So I started off talking to these various communities across the country. And the first question I asked them was really just very simply, so tell me a little bit about your equity programming or your equity initiative. And almost to a person, the phrasing of that question was flipped on me immediately. And people said, well, we don't think about equity programs and we don't think about equity initiatives. We're just fundamentally changing the way we do things. And so this is a direct quote from one of the county managers actually I spoke with, where they said, I think what we say is that equity isn't like an initiative or a program, but it's fundamentally a different way of doing work. And so if there's nothing else you take away from this presentation, I hope you will take this away, that if you plan to undertake equity, implement an equity lens in your operations, then what we are talking about is fundamentally changing the way your organization goes about its business. And so to some degree, that's terrifying, right? Because you say, what do you mean? We got to fundamentally change our organization. That's no small, trivial task. But the upside of embracing organizational change is that you can actually map it. So in contrast to equity, equity is this kind of broad, nebulous idea. Organizational change actually has a fairly distinct set of steps. And so one of the outcomes of this report is that I put together a framework which sort of synthesized the best practices in organizational change and change management alongside some of the things we were hearing about the phases of change that occur in the implementation of equity. And so while the idea of changing your organization can be daunting, the good news is there can be a fairly clear mapping of how to move equity into your organization by embracing change management and organizational change. So this is the model that I put forward in the report. I'm actually not going to go through this in this presentation, which probably sounds, like an unfair teaser, but it really just gets us into the weeds too quickly. So rather, what I want to do is just take some high-level lessons or key ideas that emerged through the report, and we'll just sort of hit those. And the 5 insights that I want to just share with you. So if we can accept that, okay, equity is about organizational change, super. Yes, we are willing to undertake a process of change management and organizational change. Then here are 5 things that can help you go down that path. The first is don't forget the words. Data drives action. Equity is a team game. Foster different partnerships and understand what's success. And I'll just go through each of these fairly quickly for you. So the first is don't forget the words, right? So the title of this webinar today in general is moving words from action or moving from words to action. And what I'm going to tell you to move from words to action in equity, step 1 is don't forget the words, right? The words are important. And by that, I mean you need to be able to define equity, prioritize equity, and normalize equity. Defining equity is no easy task, right? Equity is a vague, ambiguous term, and it is one of the places where you will meet immediate resistance, right? When you say we are going to start implementing an equity lens, we are going to have all our programming go through an equity lens, and as a public organization, we want to foster equity in our community. Almost immediately, people are going to push back and say, hold on a second, this is, why should we have completely equitable outcomes? This is anti-American. This is not the way the country was founded. You're trying to create a socialist country. This is just the narrative that will push back immediately against any discussion of equity. But of course, equity doesn't mean equality, right? And I imagine most of you all have kind of seen a lot of the presentations that talk about the difference between equity and equality. And that's an important distinction to make right out of the gate, that what we're talking about is equity, not equality. Once you sort of get your definitional terms, and there's, again, in the report, we go into a fair bit of detail about not just distinguishing equity from equality, but then also how do you operationalize it? How do you take equity from a very sort of just a good idea to things that you can operationalize in measurement? So there are a couple things about defining equity. One is distinguishing it from other like-minded terms. The other thing is bringing it into sort of an operational space. So once you've defined equity in this way that allows you to move beyond initial resistance and then start to operationalize it in your programming, the other thing you have to do is define equity in terms of your community. Equity and inequity looks different across communities. It doesn't look the same everywhere. And so part of what you need to do is you need to be able to tell your unique community story about equity and inequity and how it matters for your community. So we define what equity means. So the word equity matters, how we come to understand it matters. The second thing you have to do is you have to prioritize it. Because we are embracing equity as part of a process of organizational change, we know that equity must become a part of your strategic vision, mission, and goals. An equity lens has to be implemented throughout your organization. It cannot be housed in a corner somewhere where it's taken on by one department and one person and housed there. All equity things go through this one corner of the organization. And so once defined, once operationalized, it must become a part of your guiding documents. It's prioritized. The third use of the words is you need to normalize the use of the term equity and normalize the use of the conversations that go around that. Equity and the conversations that go in around it, around race, around gender, around human sexuality, these are all important and difficult conversations to have. So GARE, many of you may have heard of the organization called GARE. It's the Government Alliance for Racial Equity, increasingly becoming, I think, the national benchmark for local governments as they pursue the implementation of equity. Normalizing the conversation is one of their fundamental first steps. Because in order to advance equity through your organization, you have to be able to speak about things like implicit bias, like the difference between individual racism, structural racism, organizational racism. And these are hard conversations to have. And so normalizing those conversations, as opposed to putting them in what Susan Gooden calls the nervous side of government, is important. Equity has to become front and center, and it has to be a place where everyone has a shared understanding of terms so that they can speak comfortably about what equity and inequity means. It also means that a part of that conversation is about recognizing the historical legacy of local governments in this country and how they may or may not have created inequities. So the conversation has to move from, if we are going to say we are part of an organization that created racial inequities, then this organization can also become a part of the solution to undo some of those structural inequities. So moving words to action, step one, don't forget the words. The second key in moving words to action and organizational change towards equity is to understand that data will drive your action. Okay? So there are some things I imagine you know, right? Already, what gets measured gets done. It's an adage that I think public managers have been using for some time, and it's important here in the equity space. The challenge is that equity is really difficult to measure. It is super difficult to measure. And this is one, again, so if the first challenge that you're going to bump up against is resistance to the term, the second challenge you're going to bump up against is how do we measure equity? How do we track our success? How do we actually get programs to understand if their programming is more or less inequitable? And so measuring equity is really, really hard. but it forces an organization to confront the challenge head on, and it forces departmental units, the data analysts in your organization to think deeply and more systematically about what inequity means in your organization and how you are going to go about tracking it as you move forward. It's important in the communication, right? So as we communicate equity, as I said, it's a challenge you're going to bump up against. Using data is critical, right? It allows us to get away from some of the squishy terms and to start to tell people, hey, listen, here is what equity looks like and inequity looks like in our community. So here's just another quote from one of the managers I interviewed. So for me, it's data, 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 and more data. Data will tell you your problem. Data will tell you where you're making progress. Data will tell you when you're on the right or wrong path. This was a quote that came out from one of the city managers when they were talking about how they were advancing equity with their city council, right? This was a way for them to really help folks who weren't in the day-to-day administration of programs to really understand how equity was shaping throughout the organization. So data drives action. The third point to bring up is that equity is fundamentally a team game. Okay? By this, I mean, one of the challenges we saw early on, so I think a lot of it, I'll just go back in time even before this report. So I've been an academic for, I was about 12 years before I took this position here, which means that I was a scholar. I studied local governments. And when I stepped into the space of thinking about local governments and their efforts around social and racial equity, one of the first reports I wrote was for an organization called the American Society for Public Administration. And in that report, I was working with a few students, and we were looking at how local governments were measuring equity. We just jumped right in and said, okay, well, let's think about this as a performance measurement issue. And so we presented the preliminary findings of that report at a conference held by the Federal Reserve in Nashville, Tennessee. And at that time, so that was about 2011. So let's just put it there for, say, 10 years ago or so. Might have been maybe a little bit further, maybe 2013 or something like that. But the point is, not super long ago. And at that time, when we went out and we presented to this group of much like you all, they were local officials. We concluded our report, and inevitably, a line of folks lined up to chat with us after. And across the board, the story from all of them was, hey, they all were newly hired equity officers in their organization. And their story to us was, hey, we got this great job working for a great city that wants to advance equity in their organization, in their community, but we don't know what to do, and we don't know who to work with on this. So what had happened, right, was that these organizations had, in their sort of rush and excitement and interest in pursuing equity, they went straight to what they knew best, which was to hire an expert in and say, let's figure this out. The problem with that is that one of the best practices that we've come to realize is that if you want to advance equity in your organization, much like any organizational change, there needs to be an infrastructure around that issue. And the infrastructure around that issue, particularly in the area of equity, are these teams, right? So one of the things we saw across the 7 organizations we looked at and the other organizations that we interviewed that didn't make it into the final report was that they all embraced this team approach to equity. And the teams looked a little different, obviously, organization to organization, but broadly speaking, you could imagine 2 levels of teams, right? So one at the higher level of the organization, so maybe in the county manager's office, there was a core team. And this core team oversaw the broad equity opportunities, identified training opportunities, helped marshal resources to different departments when they needed the training, helped get the data aggregated up to the organizational level, communicated between the organization and stakeholders, internal and external to the organization. But you had this core team. Maybe they were department heads, maybe there was an equity officer in each department. There were different ways to comprise that, but there was a core team at the head of the organization. At the departmental level, then, there were departmental level teams. These teams were right down in the weeds, working with each department to facilitate training, to encourage and support the use of equity tools, so surveys attached to programming, developing departmental level dashboards. And these two teams, the core teams and the departmental teams, really shaped the equity infrastructure within each organization. Now notice that I haven't said anything there about the hiring of a chief equity officer or a chief diversity officer. These are not unimportant positions, right? The sort of head of an equity office, this is important to have. What we found, though, was that the issue that cities and counties bumped up against was when was the right time to bring these leaders in. They are important, they're critically important, but bringing them in too early to a change process often isolated them, made their job super challenging, because the idea that I hired an equity officer, we've got an equity office, that's all we need to do, doesn't solve the problem. These equity officers need to be connected to a series of teams, and it's much easier to bring the equity officer in when at least the beginnings of these teams are already formed. And so equity ultimately is a team game. You can't bring in a single equity unicorn to solve your equity problems. The fourth high-level finding is that you need to foster partnerships. So this, again, if for those of you familiar with organizational change and change management, this is nothing new. Partnerships are critical to success. These partnerships are both inside and outside the organization. Here's another quote, right? So those partnerships are really important in this space, talking about equity. What we know is that there's all these groups that are working on their own racial equity plans, struggling in this space. So let's bring it together so we can struggle in this space together. And to some degree, of course, that's what we're doing here today, right? And we're appreciative of the WCA for bringing these groups together, because this is going to be really important. Equity, the implementation of an equity lens in city and county government. While there's lots of cities and counties that are starting down this space, it's not so well established that there's a clear roadmap and clear examples. And indeed, even some of so Seattle is one of the cities, and King County, in which Seattle is located, are two of the leaders in really often thought of as the leaders in the implementation of an equity lens. So they were one of the first folks that I interviewed for this report, and even earlier than the development of that report. And what is amazing is that even as the leaders in this space, when asked, hey, where are you in sort of your evolution and your implementation of this lens, they said, we've just started, right? This is just everyone in the country, every county, every city that is implementing an equity lens has just started. No one is particularly that far along that they can really say, hey, we've got a good, really good handle on this. And so what's really important is that you don't feel alone in this process, right? You connect with other partners throughout the country. Again, GARE is a great networking. They have a great sort of network of local governments working in this space. And so they're a great sort of connector. There are others, the National League of Cities, obviously ICMA itself, now the WCA, right? Then you have lots of organizations through which you can connect. But the other thing is that these partnerships must also be established within your organization. So I kind of went in reverse order there, but because what is going to happen, as you say, let's implement an equity lens, it is not going to instantly take place across your entire organization. More likely, it's going to happen in a department here and a department there. And the way in which the ideas will diffuse through the organization is that you find those champions in your organization and you start to connect them to one another, perhaps by creating these departmental teams, perhaps by creating a core team. Either way, partnerships within and outside the organization are going to be critical to not just advancing equity, but sustaining equity. One of the things I'll talk about next is just that equity really is a long-term effort. And so having these partnerships and this infrastructure available to sustain your efforts in equity over the long term is going to be fundamental. So the last high-level insight I want to bring is that advancing equity, implementing an equity lens, is part of it is going to be understanding what success means in this space, right? So this was actually a really challenging question. So I asked this question of all the interviewees in the report: what does the successful implementation of an equity lens looks like? And this was hard, right? Ultimately, if you are successfully implementing an equity lens, your community ought to be becoming more equitable. So in the long term, that's really what the objective is. And so in some ways it's simple, but that's really so far down the road that it's a hard goal to hang your hat on. If that's the only thing you're going to measure success against, you've got a long time before you're going to see any success. And that's not going to sustain this equity effort, and that's not going to allow people to really grasp onto it. So rather, what we see is a lot of organizations said, well, listen, success is about making sure all the departments within our organization are effectively implementing an equity lens, are using an equity lens, not just implementing it, but actually using it in their day-to-day decision making, right? So for us, the way the new structure can work is that we have a pretty aggressive goal, and by 2020, 100% of our departments will be doing racial equity assessments. Fully mature is that we have 100% of our departments deeply rooted in this work with a really strong and sound understanding of it. So it goes a little bit beyond implementation, maybe a lot more beyond implementation, to really the effective use of equity tools. So we're using equity tools, we're rethinking the way our decisions are being made. Our data from our equity surveys are feeding into decisions on a day-to-day basis. And as I mentioned, this won't happen overnight, right? And so the lesson in understanding success, if success is that 100% of our departments are using equity and really have adopted an equity lens in their thinking, if that's what success is, it starts with one department, one unit at a time, right? It's going to start small and it's going to diffuse through your organizations. So one of the challenges that a lot of organizations, a lot of the folks we talked to bumped up against was that they wanted to start with the whole organization, right? We want to implement equity immediately. We want this change to happen across all units as quickly as we can. And that's just too daunting, right? Because some departments are already implementing equity. They have a long history of it. Others do not, right? Not by any ill intention. It's just not a part of how they've ever thought about their work. So you can imagine, for example, that maybe the housing unit in your organization has perhaps a bit more of an equity lens than say your engineering department, right? Because they just haven't necessarily thought about equity in the same way. They don't have a history of it. And so in order to sustain and advance those sort of the progression from one department to another, celebrate the small wins along the way, right? If success is 100% implementation, every little step towards a little bit more use of an equity tool, a little bit more, one more dashboard or one more decision, each of those are small wins that you ought to celebrate because it puts you on a path towards success. So I think that gets me right about to my 30 minutes. So let me just summarize quickly. Moving from words to action in the space of social and racial equity, first and foremost is about understanding that equity is organizational change. If you are going to go down this path, what you are talking about is fundamentally changing the way your organization makes its day-to-day decisions and goes about its day-to-day operations. To that end, there are at least 5 things you can think of that are going to help move you along towards that. Don't forget those words. Define them, prioritize them, and normalize them. Use data to drive the action. Create strong teams that'll help diffuse equity throughout your organization. Foster those partnerships, and have a clear vision in your head of what success in the implementation of an equity lens looks like. So with that, I do want to thank you, and I use this not just for thanking you to take the time to listen to me, which is a thank you in and of itself, but also I do just really want to thank you all for your willingness to entertain this discussion, to jump into this space. Equity in our public sector is a hard topic to address. It's a hard space to enter. And I appreciate the courage and your willingness to do it. And I do just want to conclude. So in my report, I was fortunate that Mark Ott, who I think is a former city or county manager, he's now the executive director of ICMA. He started the report by saying this, and I think it just is a nice way to conclude here. He says, instead of holding back, we must have the courage to step forward, take our bureaucratic structures down to the studs, and rebuild them through the lens of racial and social equity. And so I appreciate your willingness to jump into the equity space, and I understand the hard work that it takes to do it. And so I thank you for your willingness to listen today and hopefully to start moving in that direction. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Benoy. Again, there is one question so far in the Q&A, so if you want to review that while Jenny and Jerry are speaking, that would be great. And then when Jenny and Jerry are done, we'll get back to the questions and to the information and the comments in the chat function as well. But for now, I want to introduce our next 2 speakers. We have a pair of folks joining us this morning from Kenosha County. We have Jenny Tunkeys, who is the Chief of Staff to the Kenosha County Executive, as well as Jerry Gully, who is a Kenosha County Supervisor. They are joining us today to share how it is that they got started with DEI efforts in Kenosha County. And I really do want to, thank them in advance for agreeing to do this. I know I talked to a number of counties who were somewhat hesitant to try to talk about their efforts, simply because they said, well, we're not really far. We're not quite certain we did it right. And so I think, Jenny and Jerry, their willingness to join us today, I think they'll show that really where they are at is really no different where every other county is at. They've been where you are. And I think what they're going to say ties in a lot to what Benoy talked about as well, in terms of getting started and getting started small. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny and Jerry, and then again, we'll come back for questions at the end.
Good morning, everyone. I am working on figuring out how to share my screen. But meanwhile, we're just really pleased to be here today and share our journey, which is still in its infant stages toward racial equity in Kenosha County. And again, we're in our infant stages. We hope to inspire you if you're just starting, and maybe you'll have some great ideas if this is new for you. So Supervisor Gully, maybe you talk a little bit about how this project started for you, how you got involved in the county board in the first place.
Sure, thank you, and thanks for having us here today. I'm newly elected. I was elected in the last cycle less than a year ago, and like many people on the call today, certainly didn't expect racial equity to be something that was a significant focus of my time. And I think it's been a real privilege, especially for us in Kenosha, where we've had acute challenges with issues of equity and horrible results from everything that everyone on the call has seen in the news. It's been a real privilege to be able to be involved in this initiative. I think.
All right, so, hey, thanks for filling time, Supervisor Gully.
I was about to dance, so I'm glad you got to it.
Racial equity has been front of mind in Kenosha County, but you know, clearly we hadn't been doing enough or tried hard enough. A group of our leaders at the end of January in 2020 attended a 2-day Racial Equity Institute groundwater training. And I think it was there that it really was eye-opening that clearly what we were doing was not enough, and we needed to focus more on the bigger picture and really getting at racial disparities and racial equity and the systemic racism. But then of course, COVID happened and sucked really all the oxygen out of the room for everything. And I think we did start to have focus more on equity through our COVID testing and training processes. But then of course, on May 25th, George Floyd's murder occurred, and that really put greater emphasis across the country on what we were doing. And Supervisor Gully, maybe share a little bit about what that time was like for you.
So I think that was, as you said, that was kind of a catalyst for a couple of the initiatives that occurred in our county. One being a drive to purchase and outfit our county sheriff's department with body cameras. The second being the initiative to declare racism as a public health crisis in our county. That was something that obviously many counties in the state have done. Our resolution was not only similar, but identical to that boilerplate that many counties have implemented. And this was definitely a line in the sand that the county wanted to draw to make a commitment that this is something that we take very seriously. It was actually, I was thinking back to what some of the things that Benoy said, and we didn't just have resistance to terms, we had resistance to concepts, meaning that I assumed that this would be something that would not be controversial or debatable, but we did encounter individuals, other elected officials who don't and continue to not believe that systemic racism is real. But it did move ahead, and it certainly solidified our commitment to this issue.
And from an administration perspective, we saw this resolution as a way to really focus efforts going forward. We knew it wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of efforts. So that was passed on August 4th. And then in Kenosha County, in the city of Kenosha on August 23rd, there was the shooting of Jacob Blake, which I'm sure you've all heard about. And that created a great deal of civil unrest and concerns across Kenosha County. And Supervisor Gully, I don't know if you want to address that a little bit, but I think it really led us all to the concept that we needed to work even harder.
Certainly, and I think it was also for many of us who had been involved in trying to push this forward, in addition to all the other horrible things that you felt when that was going on, I really had such a sense of just disappointment that I feared that some of the steps we had taken forward would be negated, and maybe even we would be, pushed further back in our development. But when that did occur, a couple of the other county supervisors and myself suggested to our county executive, Jim Cruiser, that we actually enact and create a racial equity commission. And luckily, that was one of the things that he included in as a call to action in the 2021 budget.
Right. So in the budget, both body cameras for sheriff's deputies, they already had squad dash cams, but that was proposed, the body cameras, and also a racial equity commission. So we formulated a work group that Supervisor Gully is now chairing to develop the Racial Equity Commission. But meanwhile, we also wanted to take a look at Kenosha County as an employer. And so we formed diversity task forces of employees led by an outside person who could really guide that discussion. And that was an opportunity for us to look at what we were doing across the county as an employer. We also talked about hiring an HR business partner with diversity and inclusion as a specialty. And we joined the Government Alliance on Racial Equity. We've also, as part of that, discovered that we really needed to have foundational racial equity training. And we want to at least do the first round in 2021. We are working with GARE and other organizations, REI I had mentioned before. And really interested in having this as a foundation is the training. But then at the same time, we knew that our outside external position, our policies and procedures as it interacted with the public, we needed a way to evaluate that as well. So that's one of the goals that the Racial Equity Commission will have. So Supervisor Gully, maybe talk a little bit about that journey for the Racial Equity Work Group and the Commission.
Certainly. So we were tasked through the budget resolution with convening a work group that will in turn kind of document and mandate the mission and the goals and the objectives of an actual Racial Equity Commission. The work group convened the second week in January. We're now meeting weekly. It's a group of 11 individuals that were selected from lists that we solicited from lots of community leaders and elected officials. For me, it was critical to have, obviously, we talk about just you have to be very transparent. So, I'm a white dude that is leading the Racial Equity Work Group. And so that is one of the challenges, representation on elected boards and the lack of diversity is a challenge there. So the makeup of the work group needed to represent lots of different voices and perspectives in our community. To me, it was also critical that we engage with people who may not have had a platform in the past. And so we have a number of individuals working with us who come from varied backgrounds. We have a high school math teacher. We have a leader of a nonprofit that was created right after the incident with Jacob Blake to focus on progressing ideas of equity. And we've been spending the past few weeks really looking at what are the goals and what should the actual commission do. It was interesting when Benoy spoke earlier, you also have to, in an exercise like this, there is an intent to solve everything all at once. And that's just simply not possible. And so the process we're going through is really figuring out, based on the language that created this initiative, what is that swim lane that we can work within and actually implement progress. And so some of the things that we've looked at have been looking at all internal policies through the lens of racial equity. This is probably being done, but to have one body and one somewhat standardized review process, perhaps looking at contracts with external vendors, all those operations of the county government and reviewing every aspect of that to try to see where are the ways that we can impact change and reduce issues of inequity. So again, we're on that continuum of words to action. We're we've taken action, but we're probably closer to the word side than we are. My goal is to still deliver the resolution with all the details for the Equity Commission, hopefully at the end of Q1, and then try to move it through the board to get approval and then begin seating actual individuals on that commission so that they're up and running sometime in Q2.
Great. Did you touched on the mission, I believe, and also the goals. So we've realized very early on that ongoing success of whatever we do is going to definitely have to involve lots of voices, lots of people from the public. So we're all working very hard to make sure we're getting input. Supervisor Gully, anything on community input that you want to share?
I mean, obviously that is a critical element. Any initiative like this needs to be very transparent. I try to the extent possible, socialize what the topics that the work group is discussing each week. We certainly socialize the details of the meeting so that people can attend and dial in and provide feedback. It is a challenge, and it is something where I was reflecting earlier in the first presenter that what you will determine is people who don't agree with what you're doing are probably going to be somewhat critical of your actions, and people who do agree with you are probably going to be even more critical because they have in their mind a very specific pathway that your initiative needs to be on. And so if you deviate from that, it may be perceived that you're not doing enough, that you're not doing enough today, that you're not thinking holistically enough. And so I think pulling together a group like we've done helps create our compass that we're going to follow to help guide you through some of that, those criticisms and the comments that you get from the public.
So I think as we move forward, we know that what we do might not be perfect, but we want to keep working on it, and every day just make it a focus and try a little harder. So I think with that, we can open it up for questions. I guess, Sarah, I don't know if you're going to moderate questions for all of us.
No, I will do that. All right. So we have, and all speakers should feel free to jump in on all of these questions, but we will get started with the first question that came in, Benoy, when you were speaking. So I assume this one is for you. The first is, how can individual communities define what equity we want in our community? We are trying to find the data to help drive the process to be data-driven, but not easily found, such as statistical data. Benoy?
Yeah, it's a great question, it's a great question because I think a lot of communities do grapple with this, right? The answer, and it came up a lot in the studies that I worked on, and the answer was really start with the low-hanging fruit, right? There is data out there. It may not be the perfect data, it may not be the perfect measure, but if you try to find perfect, you're really not gonna move, right? So one, you could scour for sort of what is the low-hanging fruit for your particular community. Maybe it's health data that you have on record. Maybe it's data about the use of your libraries, your public libraries, which is a place that a lot of communities actually start some of their equity efforts. So there's probably some data sources around if you just kind of look at the low-hanging fruit and sort of see how you can tell your story. Now, the other part of that is that maybe it's not data, right? Maybe data is just too daunting for you to collect in the sort of numerical sense, so quantitative data. It may just be too hard to collect in the short term. And so maybe the answer is you can develop some qualitative data. Interview your communities, talk to your residents, get some stories, develop a narrative. And as you're developing that narrative, start filling in your data gaps. And so those are the two, right? Look for the low-hanging fruit, I would say. If there is no low-hanging fruit, then I would say start developing sort of a qualitative narrative and try to fill in the blanks as you're doing that.
All right, we will move on to the next question. Have Kenosha County officials accepted or recognized that systemic racism is real? Many of ours have not. I believe you talked about that. How have you addressed that issue in Kenosha?
Well, Supervisor Benoy, I don't know, maybe you can speak to that better. I would say it's certainly still a mixed bag. Not everyone is accepting of the terms or that situation. We certainly do from an administrative perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is you will continue to have individuals, sometimes of influence, whether they be elected, appointed, just citizens that have large platforms who will continue to say that this isn't real. One thing I've discovered, and this is purely anecdotal, purely from my limited experience, but I have found a relatively strong correlation between people who say that systemic racism doesn't exist and people who would most certainly consider themselves people who really focus on fiscal responsibility. And so I try to have a discussion around the fact that the issues we talk about of equity are also issues of economics. And I work in healthcare, and preventative healthcare is always more cost effective than treating chronic conditions. And many of the issues we talk about are similar to that. It is much cheaper to invest in things like addiction treatment programs than it is to fund incarceration. And so I think that is a different way to look at this, and maybe you know, I have a hard time with that because to me it's very clear, but as we all know, you're going to engage with a lot of people who don't have the same beliefs, and so it's finding that point of reference that you can talk about, and then find what you do have in common with them, and say, well, if we want to work toward this, here's some ways to possibly do that.
One of the things I've shared with Sarah that she can share with everyone is a video that talks about the racial financial gap. I think that's really educational for people, and especially people who might not agree with structural racism. It's at least a talking point.
Can I just jump in there for a quick second, Sarah?
Absolutely.
I think I think Jerry and Jenny, your points are right on, right? I think you know, another so one part of that. So I saw a lot of the questions are about how do we get unstuck from this disbelief in systemic racism. You know, so one part of that, and I think part of what Jerry's hitting on is that a lot of the resistance to an equity lens is because there is a sense that in order to make the world more equitable, we must take resources away from those who already have, right? And that's not quite correct, right? The fact that you're allowing people who are currently disadvantaged to become more advantaged doesn't take away from those who are already advantaged. I mean, it's not a zero-sum game in that way.
It's not pie.
Yeah, that's right. No, it's exactly it. That's right. And that's the fear, right? I think that's the fear that drives a lot of this resistance. Well, does that mean if you're making the schools over there better, you're going to make ours worse? And that's not the case, right? There's a lot of ways to make the world better without making other places worse. So it's not a zero-sum game. And I think that's really important. And then just another part of this is that data does help, right? Data really does help. You're going to, if you can tell, so when you bump into this type of resistance, some of it, you know, as you pile on the data about the existence of systemic racism, what it does look like in the world, it's hard to start to deny that. And so you sort of put those pieces together, data that shows the existence of systemic racism, or even just the implications of racism or the implications of inequity, and then the reality that you have policies and programs that don't result in zero-sum games. I think that's about as good as you can do, right?
All right, I'm going to try to, I think we have a number of questions, as you mentioned, Benoy, that address that issue. There's couple other questions here I want to address in the time we have remaining. One of them is, what would you say to the leaders of many communities in Wisconsin that have a very low BIPOC population that can easily be written off and ignored? Why tackle equity issues in a white dominant county?
Can I jump in on this? I'll jump in quick because I'll tell you. So this is I find this really an important part of the conversation. So when I started my interviews, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, whatever it is. So I started, and the proposal I put to ICMA wasn't about racial equity. It was about social equity. And I bumped into this a lot. So because I'd start my interview by saying, so tell me about your social equity program. And immediately people would say, we have a racial equity program. And I kept getting pushback for this. And I basically asked the same question of why do you lead with racial equity? There's a whole world of inequity. Why would you lead with racial equity? And I think the answer that comes back sort of addresses this. And the answer that came back was that when you lead with racial equity, and this is a little bit of a hypothesis. I don't know that it's empirically true, but it's at least to me sort of a compelling answer, is that when you lead with racial equity, other inequities follow. So gender inequity follows. Inequities around LGBTQ communities follow. And so what does that mean for predominantly white counties or communities? Well, I'm sure they're not perfectly equal, right? And I'm sure there are inequities that exist within them. So my response to them is that, hey, if you want to deal with the inequities you have, it's not going to hurt to look at the inequities that exist in other communities. Now, it's not a perfect answer, but it's certainly one of the answers that bubbled up. And I think it's a reasonable response. I've increasingly become convinced that this is a reasonable response.
I apologize. I was typing in an answer to a question we asked about whether or not your report would be made available to the group. Absolutely. We will put it on the WCA website. Okay, some other questions here for Kenosha. Can you talk about how you are working on both the internal pieces of your county policies and workforce and the external community response?
So internal, like I said, we put together a diversity task force. We went to employees and we said, if you're interested in this work, let us know. We'd like to bring you into a conversation. And got a really good response. We had someone lead that discussion who is not connected at this time with Kenosha County government so that people would feel comfortable talking. What came out of that, one of the many things that came out of that, that went from September through December. There's a desire to have affinity groups form. So we're going to work on that. We're hoping Gare will give us some guidance on putting together affinity groups. A lot of talk about the need for employee training around systemic racism. So yeah, as I indicated before, we're working on that. The group said they wanted more celebrations, more recognition of things like Black History Month, of Women's History Month, that kind of thing, of Cinco de Mayo, that stuff. So we're putting together programs around that. And then for external, I mean, I think that's where we really hope that the Racial Equity Commission can help guide us, because we are the fish in the water, so we might not see what we're doing that has created these inequitable policies. So we're trying to figure out how the Racial Equity Commission can help drive that work. And that would include things like, why is there a disproportionate number of Black children in foster care? Is there something that we're doing as we evaluate situations differently? But again, because, we've all worked in these situations and lived under these policies, you might not see what's right in front of you. So I think that's where we're hoping that will help guide that work. But again, still in our infant stages.
All right, thank you, Jenny. So I will mention we are at 10:01 right now, so we are past our ending time. I will mention that we will keep track of the questions and the information in the chat that we did not get to during this webinar today, and we will do some follow-up work. There was one item in the chat that did reference asking whether or not we know what other counties in Wisconsin have models, resolutions, commissions, examples of data categories that can be shared. One of the things we will be doing as an association following this webinar series is reaching out to every county and just asking, what is it that you are doing within your county, so that we will be able to share that information with other folks. So you might know, who is the contact person in our neighboring county working on these issues? You know, what counties have passed resolutions? What do those resolutions look like? Have you started a commission within your county? If so, what is that mission statement within your county? This is the type of information we are going to work on gathering so that it can be shared with all of the counties from across the state. Because again, as we know, and as we talked about partnership, working together, we can't do this alone. So we are going to do what we can to gather what information currently exists in Wisconsin and make sure that it gets shared with everybody. All right, with that, I want to thank you so much for joining us this morning. Thanks to Benoy, Jenny, and Jerry for speaking to us today, sharing what is happening in your county, as well as sharing a lot of the research that you have conducted. Again, the information, the PowerPoints, Benoy's report, there's additional information from Kenosha County with regard to their mission statement and other documents that Kenosha has prepared that we will be sharing on our website, and it will be sent out as well midweek to everybody, along with the reminder for next week's webinar, where we will be talking about Wisconsin County efforts and how to work with community partners. So I think that's a great follow-up to some of the stuff that we heard from Benoy and Jenny and Jerry today. So with that, I want to thank you guys so much for joining us today, and have a great week.